The median house price in Sydney right now sits above 1.4 million Australian dollars. In Melbourne, you are looking at north of $1 million just to get in the door. But somewhere in the red dirt interior of this country, there are houses, real houses, on real land, selling for 62,500 Australian dollars, based on 16 sales tracked through realestate.com.au. I know that sounds like a misprint. It is not. And it is not one town. It is a pattern running across South Australia, Western Australia, Queensland, and New South Wales. And the people already living there are not exactly putting up billboards to advertise it. Realestate.com.au does not hide these numbers. They sit there in the suburb profiles attached to real sales, real transactions, real titles. What gets hidden is the context. The 40-degree summers, the 500-kilometre drives to a specialist hospital, the roads that vanish under floodwater for weeks at a time. The platforms show the price. They do not show you what the price is attached to. Locals who have been out here for decades understand the exchange in a way that a browser search cannot communicate. These are not overlooked bargains waiting to be discovered. They are priced exactly where they are for reasons the market has been communicating for a long time. Here are 9 of them. The median house price in Andamooka runs $62,500 Australian, based on 16 sales tracked through realestate.com.au, a figure that realestate.com.au also cross-referenced at $60,000 Australian across 17 sales. On a small market like this, those two figures are not contradicting each other. They are describing the same reality from slightly different angles. A market with 16 sales in 12 months is not a deep or liquid market. It is a thin one, where a single motivated buyer or a single distressed seller can shift the reported median by thousands of dollars in either direction. So hold the number loosely, but do not dismiss it. The broad picture is consistent. Andamooka is one of the most affordable, verified housing markets in Australia, full stop. The town sits roughly 600 kilometres north of Adelaide, in the arid country of South Australia, close to Lake Torrens and the edge of the Stuart Range. The nearest town of any real size is Roxby Downs, which itself is not what anyone would call a metropolitan centre. Drive further, and you are looking at Port Augusta as your closest point of meaningful retail, medical, and infrastructure. And that drive is real, not a minor commute. For residents, the distance is not occasional background context. It is a daily operating condition. Shopping trips get planned, medical situations get assessed. Everything beyond the town's own limited services has to be factored in before it becomes urgent. Andamooka's economy is tied to the opal fields. This has been true for most of the town's modern existence, and it remains true in 2026. The opal fields brought people out here, fossickers, miners, families chasing a strike, and the opal fields defined the culture that developed as a result. It is a rough, independent, self-reliant kind of place, where the expectation is that you handle your own problems, and the community absorbs those who can keep up with that pace. The population currently sits at around 260, and that number has been low for years. There is no demographic pressure pushing prices upward. There is no wave of remote workers relocating here from Adelaide. The price is low because the demand is low, and the demand is low because the town makes no attempt to hide what it is. The physical environment does a lot of the filtering. Summer temperatures regularly push above 40 degrees Celsius, and the dust is a constant. It gets into everything: machinery, buildings, lungs, routines. Houses in Andamooka are not maintained the way a suburban investment property gets maintained. They get maintained the way something in a desert gets maintained, practically, with the assumption that the climate will keep working against you. A house here for $62,500 Australia is a functional shelter in a harsh place, not a renovated retreat. Water is a managed resource. Air conditioning is not optional. Power costs are real. Anyone pricing the lifestyle only from the purchase price is missing most of the calculation. There is no hospital in Andamooka. There is no secondary school. There is no chain supermarket. What the town has, it has. What it does not have, you travel for or go without. The Royal Flying Doctor Service provides medical access that would otherwise not exist at all, and that service is not a comfort level upgrade. It is a structural necessity. For some people, that kind of stripped-back infrastructure reads as freedom from over-regulated, overpriced, overserviced city living. For others, it reads as risk. Both of those readings are correct, depending entirely on who is doing the reading. What keeps Andamooka honest is that it does not ask for sympathy, and it does not pretend to be something it is not. The people who stay here, and some families have been here for generations, chose this specific trade: low cost, high exposure, and a way of life that filters out anyone who needs the city's soft infrastructure to function. The opal fields give the town a mythology that few outback places can match, the kind where individual luck still operates on a geological scale. But the mythology does not pay the fuel bill, and it does not close the distance to the nearest emergency room. The desert here decides who stays. That has always been the terms, and the housing market is just one more way the desert communicates them. There are very few places on Earth where a significant portion of the residential population lives underground by choice and necessity rather than novelty. Coober Pedy, South Australia, is one of them. The town sits around 850 kilometres north of Adelaide, in some of the most consistently brutal heat in the country. And decades ago, residents figured out that digging into the sandstone hills was not an eccentric move. It was the practical one. Underground homes, called dugouts, maintain a stable temperature year-round when the surface is baking past 45 degrees Celsius. This is not a tourist gimmick. People raise children in dugouts. They have been doing it for generations. The median house price in Coober Pedy runs around 70,000 Australian, based on 44 sales tracked through realestate.com.au over the past 12 months. A 2026 realestate.com.au article on rental yields referenced $76,250, and SA market snapshots have shown figures close to 69,000 Australian. The range is tight enough to be consistent. For a town with a population of around 1,437 people, by far the largest community so far on this list, that price point is a signal, not an accident. Coober Pedy has a functioning commercial centre, a hospital, schools, and opal tourism infrastructure that Andamooka cannot match. And yet the median price is only marginally higher. The premium of services does not move the market much when the other costs are this clear. Coober Pedy is the self-declared opal capital of the world, and that is not marketing language without substance. The fields around this town produce a significant share of the global opal supply, which has attracted people from dozens of countries over the past century. Walk through town, and the cultural mix reflects that history. Greek, Serbian, Lebanese, Aboriginal, Italian communities all put down roots here through the mining decades, and the town's social fabric is more internationally layered than most outback places its size. That history adds something to the town's character that the price alone does not communicate, but the drawbacks here are structural, not cosmetic. The heat is not an inconvenience, it is an engineering challenge. Buildings on the surface require constant cooling, roads buckle, water is costly and managed. The opal mining economy runs on cycles that the global gemstone market controls, not anything local. When opal prices are strong and tourists are moving, Coober Pedy hums. When those cycles pull back, the town feels it quickly and directly. The isolation from Adelaide means that supply chains, medical referrals, and any kind of specialist service involve long travel times that residents simply factor into their lives as a given. Ask anyone who has been out here for more than a couple of years, and they will tell you the same thing. The first year resets your expectations for what convenience actually means. The underground living aspect deserves more than a passing mention. A dugout is not a cave in the primitive sense. The ones built or extended over decades can be substantial homes, multiple rooms, full electrical fit-outs, modern kitchens, all carved into hillsides and maintained by people who know exactly what they are doing. The consistent internal temperature is a genuine quality of life advantage, and a dugout property on the market in Coober Pedy can be among the most thermally stable homes in Australia. That said, they require specific knowledge to maintain, specific assessment before purchase, and a comfort level with living without windows that not everyone can honestly claim to have until they actually try it. Some people love it, others last a few months. The town's isolation also creates a kind of self-selection that people who stay tend to value. Coober Pedy does not attract casual residents. The people who end up here long-term, who build their lives around the opal fields, the desert, and the particular community that has assembled itself this far from everywhere else, tend to have a clear-eyed view of what they chose and why. There is a real pride in having decided that this place, with all its difficulty, is worth the trade. $70,000 for a house in a town with a hospital, a school, and a history that runs underground through the sandstone. That is a number that requires context, and the context is everything. Something shifts after these first two South Australian cases. Both towns run on opal, both are priced well below any coastal comparison, and both make the trade explicit. But the next town on the list operates on an even smaller scale, a population that barely reaches triple digits, and a median price reported at 87,000 Australian dollars on a market so thin that one or two sales can rewrite it entirely. The question is not just whether the price is real, it is what a price means when almost nobody is buying or selling at all. Menzies, Western Australia, sits about 130 kilometres north of Kalgoorlie on the Great Eastern Highway, deep in the Goldfields region. The current population comes in at around 103 people. That is not a rounding error. It is a town small enough that a single family moving in or out can register as a demographic event. Founded during the 1890s gold rush, Menzies was once a genuine centre of the goldfields rush, a place with multiple hotels, a railway line, and thousands of miners moving through. What you find in 2026 is the residue of that era: heritage buildings standing against a flat, hot landscape, a lake on the edge of town that holds a genuinely unusual art installation, and a housing market that reflects what happens when demand nearly disappears, but the physical town does not. The median house price reported by Your Property Guide for Menzies sits at 87,000 Australian dollars. The Rewa suburb profile for the town was located, but did not show a visible numeric median in the available data. In a town with a triple-digit population, it is worth being direct. The market here is so small that this median is built on very few transactions. One or two sales in a 12-month window can set the median entirely. That is not a reason to dismiss the figure, but it is a reason to treat it as a directional indicator rather than a stable market benchmark. The broader point stands. Property in Menzies is priced at a level that reflects extreme distance, minimal services, and a very limited pool of buyers. Lake Ballard is the detail that puts Menzies on certain maps. The Anthony Gormley sculpture installation, 51 cast-iron figures spread across the Salt Lake, draws visitors who might otherwise have no reason to travel this far into the goldfields. The figures were created from body scans of Menzies community members, and they stand in the silence of the salt flat in a way that is genuinely striking if you make the trip. But the art installation and the town are operating in two different economic realities. The lake attracts day trippers and art tourists. The town itself remains tiny, underserviced, and largely unchanged by that attention. The visitors take photographs and drive back to Kalgoorlie. The 103 residents stay. The infrastructure in Menzies is what you would expect from a town this size in this location. There is a school, a roadhouse, and limited local services. Kalgoorlie is the closest point of access to a full-service hospital, retail, and the kind of commercial activity that people in cities take for granted. That is a 130-kilometre drive on a highway that can be unforgiving in extreme heat. For any medical situation that requires immediate specialist care, the calculus becomes more complicated. The isolation here is not softened by strong internet infrastructure, frequent air access, or road conditions that stay consistent year-round. What Menzies offers, and what a small number of people genuinely want, is near total removal from the pressures that drive property prices in places with more people. The Goldfields landscape has a particular quality: flat, vast, hot and quiet, in a way that urban environments simply cannot replicate. The sunrise over the Salt Lake, the silence at night broken by nothing mechanical, the sense of being at a significant remove from any concentrated population. These things are not nothing to the people who seek them, but the seeking has to be deliberate. Menzies does not present itself as a lifestyle destination. It presents itself as what it is: a small goldfields town that survived the end of the rush, kept its bones, and accommodates a small number of people who have decided that this distance is not a cost. It is the point. The gold rush legacy visible in the townscape is a reminder of how dramatically conditions can reverse. Buildings that were put up in the expectation of a permanent growing population now stand with a fraction of that population around them. The heritage structures are not maintained by tourism revenue or government grants alone. They persist partly because, in a dry inland climate, structures built to last tend to last, even when the economic reason for their existence is long gone. That gap between the scale of the built environment and the current population is one of the stranger visual experiences the Goldfields offers. If you have ever driven across the Nullarbor Plain, or if you know someone who has, you know that Norseman sits at a particular kind of hinge point. It is the last town of any real service capacity before the long crossing west to east, and the first recognisable town you reach if you are coming the other way. That geographic position has defined Norseman's character for decades, a place people reach, stop at, stock up in, and keep moving through. The current population is around 570, and the property market reflects the town's function more than its potential. The median house price runs $100,000 Australian dollars based on 27 sales tracked through realestate.com.au over the past year. A separate realestate.com.au snapshot also showed 110,000 Australian on the same 27 sales, so the number sits in that band. Norseman's economy has always rested on two legs: mining and transit. The Goldfields gold mining history here goes back to the 1890s, and the town carries that legacy in its streetscape and its culture. The Dundas gold mine and a series of others drew population into this part of Western Australia during the rush years, and mining activity of various scales has continued to cycle through since then. The highway function came later, but reinforced the town's survival. As long as the road between Perth and the eastern states runs through here, Norseman keeps its fuel, its food, and its accommodation services working for travellers. That keeps a floor under the local economy that purely mining-dependent towns sometimes lose when the cycle turns. At $100,000, Norseman sits at a price point that starts to represent genuine value by national standards. But the drawbacks are structured into the location itself. Perth is around 725 kilometres to the west. Esperance, the nearest coastal town with fuller services, is about 200 kilometres south. Kalgoorlie, the regional hub of the Goldfields, is roughly 190 kilometres to the north. Any of these drives on a hot day, in a vehicle that has not been maintained, on roads that have had a season's worth of heavy truck traffic running across them, is not casual. The remoteness is not just distance, it is time, cost, and the constant need to manage logistics that city living removes from daily consideration. The housing stock in Norseman runs from modest workers' cottages to larger homes on bigger blocks, the kind of space that town living in a major city makes financially impossible for most people. For a $100,000 to a $110,000 Australian dollars, a buyer can get a solid house with land, outbuildings, and room that would cost 10 times that figure in suburban Perth. That reality is not hidden, it is simply attached to everything else that Norseman is: the heat that runs to 40 degrees regularly in summer, the limited school options beyond primary level, the town's economy that rises and falls with mining cycles, and the sense that Norseman is a place you commit to, rather than a place you drift into. Residents who have been here for years tend to describe the place in terms of what it is not, and mean it positively. It is not crowded, it is not expensive. It is not a place where the weekend traffic tests your patience or your housing decision gets second-guessed by a market moving faster than you can track. The Nullarbor on one side and the Goldfields on the other frame a life that operates at a pace and scale that is simply not available in any metropolitan area in Australia. The people who choose Norseman and stay tend to have made a clear decision about what they value. The market at $100,000 Australian sits exactly where it sits because the decision required to get here keeps the buyer pool exactly where it is. 4 towns deep, all of them south and west of the country's population centres, all of them carrying prices that would not survive 20 minutes on a Sydney or Melbourne listing before disappearing. But the next case introduces a different kind of distance, not just kilometres, but the distance of a name that became a national metaphor. A town where $115,000 Australian dollars buys you into a myth that the data does not fully support and the heat does not soften. Deep Western Queensland operates by rules that the coastal cities of Brisbane and the Gold Coast do not recognise. The climate is harsher, the rainfall is unreliable, the distances to services are real, and the economy runs on wool, cattle, and the seasonal labour that connects to both. Cunnamulla sits at the southern edge of this world, on the Warrego River, about 790 kilometres from Brisbane by road. The current population is around 1,233, making it a genuine outback service town rather than a micro-settlement. The median house price runs 115,000 Australian, based on 22 sales tracked through realestate.com.au. Other realestate.com.au snapshots have shown figures closer to 100,000 Australian, based on 23 to 24 sales, which tells you the market is moving within a band rather than holding one fixed number. The Cunnamulla fella myth is real and embedded. Slim Dusty's song gave the town a cultural presence in Australian consciousness that extends far beyond its actual size and geography, and there is a statue in town that acknowledges it. But the mythology and the lived reality of Cunnamulla in 2026 are running in different directions. The actual town is a hard, dry service centre for the surrounding pastoral properties, a place where the pub, the hardware store, and the local mechanics matter more than the tourist narrative. Drought cycles have hit this region repeatedly over the past 2 decades, and the pastoral economy that underpins the town's existence does not operate on the smooth, upward curve that growth investors expect. The Peru River flood history is part of Cunnamulla's character that property buyers need to understand before anything else. The town has experienced significant flood events that temporarily cut road access, isolate properties, and create the kind of logistical disruption that urban Australians rarely have to factor into their planning. The Warrego River, which runs through town, is the same system that can flood West Queensland's Channel Country for weeks at a time in a wet year. This is not a remote possibility, it is a recurring reality that the region's residents plan around as a matter of course. Houses priced at 115,000 Australian dollars or below in this country are priced with that risk factored in, whether or not it is explicitly stated in the listing. For the person willing to genuinely live in Cunnamulla rather than just hold property there, the trade has real components that the price alone does not communicate. The pace of life is slow in the way that is not a tourism brochure cliché, but an actual operating condition. Fewer cars, less commercial noise, longer gaps between the kind of social friction that compressed urban living generates constantly. The outback community culture in places like this is built around events, the rodeo, the races, the shows, that function as genuine social infrastructure in a way that city life disperses across 1,000 atomized choices. Residents who have been here for decades talk about knowing their neighbours in a way that most Australian metropolitan residents have stopped expecting. But the filter that Cunnamulla applies is real and it operates quickly. People move out here, drawn by the price, the space, or the myth of a simpler life, and within 12 months many of them are reversing the decision. The distance to the nearest hospital with full acute services is the first thing that recalibrates expectations. Charleville, 200 kilometres to the north, has a district hospital. Brisbane, with full specialist services, is 790 kilometres away. For a family with young children or older members, that distance is not theoretical. It is the calculation you make every time someone gets sick, every time something breaks in a way that local services cannot fix, and every time the road west closes under floodwater and the timeline for everything extends by days. The land around Cunnamulla in good years is striking in a way that the word flat does not fully capture. The Mitchell grass plains, the dry creek systems, the sudden scale of sky that the inland gives you when there is nothing interrupting the horizon in any direction. It is a specific aesthetic that some people find genuinely compelling and others find genuinely oppressive, depending on what they brought with them. The town is cheap because the distance is real, the climate is hard, and the gap between the dream of outback living and the practice of it is exactly as wide as the 790 kilometres between here and Brisbane. Cunnamulla is what many people say they want, until they actually arrive. The name Meekatharra is known throughout the Australian road network as a reference point rather than a destination, a place you pass through or a sign you read when calculating how far you are from Carnarvon, from Newman, from anywhere with a full-service hospital. The town sits in the Midwest region of Western Australia, roughly 760 kilometres north of Perth, at the edge where the pastoral station country transitions toward the desert interior. The median house price is 143,000 Australian dollars, reported by your property guide for Meekatharra WA 6642. The Rewa suburb profile for the town exists, but did not show a visible numeric median in the available data, which means the Your Property Guide figure is the clearest anchor available, not a confirmed market-wide consensus. Meekatharra's economy is built on three things that the town itself did not choose: its position on the road network, the golden mineral deposits in the surrounding region, and the role it plays as a service node for the pastoral stations spread across the surrounding country. That economic structure creates a particular kind of stability that is different from growth. The town is not shrinking toward nothing, because the roads and the mines and the stations still need a service point. But it is also not growing in any direction that would push the property market upward. The people who work here are largely working the mines, the roads, or the stations, and the housing market reflects the wages and the ambitions of that workforce rather than any broader demand from outside. The infrastructure reality in Meekatharra is sharper than in some of the other towns on this list. The nearest regional hospital of any substance is Geraldton, which sits about 530 kilometres to the southwest. For emergency care, the Royal Flying Doctor Service operates out of a base that serves this region, and that is not a secondary option, it is the primary one for serious medical events. The school offers education to Year 12, which is more than some towns this size can provide, and that single fact makes a real difference for families with children, weighing up whether a move this far north is sustainable beyond the first few years. The heat in the Murchison country around Meekatharra is not a seasonal condition. It is an annual state, with a cooler interruption in winter. Summer temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius are routine, and the dust and the dry winds that come with extreme heat in this part of Western Australia are constant management problems for anyone maintaining a property. Houses here are built with the assumption that the climate will push back. Shade structures, insulation, and evaporative cooling are not upgrades, they are baseline requirements for livable conditions. Anyone calculating the cost of ownership in Meekatharra needs to price the infrastructure of survival alongside the purchase price. What gives Meekatharra a particular character, distinct from the purely functional mining camp feel that some remote towns carry, is the presence of Aboriginal community connection to country in this region. The Yamatji people have connection to the lands around here that predates the gold rush, the pastoral expansion, and the road network by thousands of years. That cultural context is part of the town's social reality, not background decoration, and it shapes the dynamics of daily life in ways that newcomers, particularly those arriving with city assumptions about how communities operate, will need time and genuine attention to understand and respect. At $143,000, Meekatharra sits at a price point where the gap between the purchase cost and the cost of the lifestyle it requires starts to become visible. The house itself may be affordable in the most direct sense. The life around the house, the fuel, the travel, the logistics management, the heat management, the distance from services, is a second and ongoing cost that does not appear in any listing. Residents here have understood that calculation for years. It is not a secret. It is the operating agreement of the town, visible to anyone who stays long enough to understand what the price is actually for. There is a phrase that has been in Australian English long enough to lose its edges: Baka Bourke. It means remote, it means far, it means beyond the comfortable part of the map where services and populations cluster and distances between things stay manageable. The phrase did not develop as a tourism slogan. It developed because Bourke, New South Wales, genuinely sits at the edge of the settled interior, a place where the Darling River runs through red dirt country 770 kilometres northwest of Sydney, and where the economic and social gravity of the coast fades into something more self-contained and harder to sustain. The median house price in Bourke runs $165,000 Australian dollars based on 35 sales tracked through realestate.com.au over the past 12 months. That is a more substantial sales volume than several towns earlier on this list, which means the median here carries more statistical weight. This is not a market set by one or two transactions. 35 sales in 12 months in a town of this size represents genuine market activity, and the median that emerges from that activity is $165,000 Australian dollars, a figure that, set against any comparable coastal New South Wales market, would be considered a pricing error. In Bourke, it is simply where the market is. The town has real history. It was a significant inland port during the riverboat era of the 19th century, a period when the Darling River was a genuine freight highway connecting the pastoral interior to the coast, and when Bourke functioned as a commercial centre of considerable importance. The buildings from that era are still standing: the courthouse, the heritage commercial strip, the scale of civic infrastructure that reflects a town designed for a larger future than it eventually received. All of this is present and visible, creating a particular kind of historical dissonance, where the architecture tells one story and the 2026 population tells another. The climate in Bourke is extreme by most Australian standards, and Australian standards are already not gentle. Summer temperatures regularly reach above 45 degrees Celsius, and heat waves that breach 47 degrees are not unheard of. The town holds records in Australian weather history for sustained heat events, and those records were not set in some ancient past. They are part of an ongoing climate pattern that anyone considering a move here will be living inside. The Darling River, which gave the town its reason to exist, also creates flood exposure in wet years that can cut roads and access for extended periods. The geography that shaped Bourke's importance in the 19th century is still shaping its operational reality in 2026. Bourke's services are better than some outback towns of comparable population, but they are structured around a regional centre that is still a long drive from the major centres of New South Wales. The hospital in Bourke provides services, but for specialist care or complex medical situations, Dubbo is roughly 360 kilometres to the southeast and carries the full-service regional hospital burden for this part of the state. That distance is not a worst-case scenario. It is a fact about how health access works out here, and families who have been in Bourke for generations have built that reality into how they plan their lives. You might think that $165,000 for a house in a town with a real hospital, real history, and a recognisable name in the Australian cultural vocabulary sounds like a straightforward deal. But the name is part of the complexity. The phrase Bacco Bourke does not just describe geography, it describes a psychological distance that the Australian market has been assigning to this town for over a century. And that psychological distance is real enough to hold the property market exactly where it is. Residents who have been here for years understand that the price is low not because the town lacks value, but because the value it holds requires a certain tolerance for what it costs to live inside it. The heat and the distance are not abstractions. They are the daily terms. The cultural life of Bourke has a depth that surprises people who arrive expecting an emptied shell. The Bacco Bourke Exhibition Centre does genuine work to communicate the history of the region. The annual events that mark the pastoral calendar, shearing season, the races, the seasonal movement of the station workforce, give the town a rhythm that is different from anything on the coast but no less real. And the Darling River in the evening light, when the heat has dropped and the flat country turns from red to orange to dark, is the kind of thing that keeps people who chose this life from ever fully explaining the choice to anyone who did not make it. 7 towns tracked. All of them hold prices that Sydney investors would treat as entry-level renovation budgets for a bathroom. But the next case is the one that sits furthest inside Outback Queensland, where the opal country and the sheep country overlap, and the buyer pool is so small that 14 sales in a year sets the entire median. $174,500. The horizon there is measured in days of driving, not hours. Quilpie is the kind of place you reach after a long drive through country that has been trying to tell you something about scale and emptiness for the past several hundred kilometres. It sits in southwest Queensland, around 990 kilometres west of Brisbane, in a landscape that mixes channel country, opal-bearing earth, and the kind of silence that has actual texture once you stop moving and listen to it. The current population is not tracked in the available data with a confirmed figure, but the housing market gives you a sense of the scale. The median house price is $174,500 Australian dollars, based on 14 sales tracked through realestate.com.au over the past 12 months. 14 sales. That is a market thin enough that each individual transaction is a meaningful data point, and the median that emerges from it should be read as a directional signal, not a fixed market reality. Quilpie is known in 2 contexts that rarely overlap. The first is opal. The region produces boulder opal, the type embedded in ironstone that splits to reveal the iridescent colour play inside. And the town has an opal culture that runs through its retail, its tourism, and its identity in a way that visitors notice quickly. The second context is the pastoral industry. Sheep and cattle stations cover the country around here in scales that are difficult to communicate to people who have never been in station country. A single property here might cover ground that would contain dozens of suburbs in a city. The town itself exists to serve that pastoral economy and the people moving through it. The nearest hospital with full services from Quilpie is Charleville, about 210 kilometres to the east on the Boulogne Highway. That drive, through flat channel country, in heat that in summer can approach 45 degrees Celsius, on roads that can become impassable after significant rainfall, is the medical reality for anyone living in Quilpie. It is not a detail at the edge of the picture, it is a central operating condition of life here. The Royal Flying Doctor Service provides aerial medical access, and that service is used regularly rather than occasionally. It is embedded into the town's functional infrastructure, the way an ambulance service is embedded into a city's. The landscape around Quilpie is, by any honest description, vast. The Mitchell grass, the dry channels, the red and orange ironstone country, the skies that in clear weather show more stars than most people born in cities have ever seen. This is the aesthetic of southwest Queensland, and it is not subtle. The light here operates differently than anywhere with buildings tall enough to interrupt it. Sunrise and sunset in Quilpie move across the full 360-degree horizon in a way that sounds like tourism prose until you are actually standing in it and realising that the description is just accurate. But the vastness is also what filters the buyer pool to 14 transactions a year. The same emptiness that makes the landscape compelling makes the lifestyle demanding in ways that do not show up in any listing photograph. For $174,500, a buyer in Quilpie is getting a house with land in a community that has a school, a hospital referral pathway, local services, and a cultural identity that is not performing for outsiders. The town's social fabric, built around the pastoral calendar, the local events, the informal networks of people who have been working this country for generations, is real and functional, even if it is not accessible on first contact. Newcomers here describe a particular experience of the first year. The town watches, assesses, and eventually includes, but on its own terms and its own timeline. The community is not hostile to outsiders. It is simply not shaped around making them comfortable before they have proven they understand the terms. The flood exposure in Quilpie's surrounding region is one of the most significant practical concerns for property buyers. Channel country flood events can be dramatic and extended, not the fast-moving flash flood of coastal catchments, but the slow, spreading inundation of flat country where water can cover enormous areas and stay for weeks. Roads close, supply chains stretch. The town becomes genuinely isolated in ways that city-trained problem solvers find disorienting the first time they encounter it. Locals manage this with a familiarity that comes from having watched it happen multiple times and built the logistics of extended isolation into their standard operating assumptions. That knowledge is not written down anywhere accessible. It is held by the community and passed through it, and it is part of the reason that $174,570 here is not the same entry point as $174,570 anywhere else in Queensland. Every town covered so far has been defined primarily by what it lacks. The service is not present, the distance is too long, the population too thin to generate the kind of market pressure that pushes property values in any upward direction. Broken Hill runs a different version of the same story. This is a city, a real one, with grand heritage architecture, a functioning arts community, a working infrastructure grid, a cultural identity that includes the Silver City Cornish pasty and the Brushman of the Bush painting tradition, and a residential population that makes it one of the largest centres in Outback New South Wales. And the median house price, based on 519 sales tracked through realestate.com.au over the past 12 months, is $232,000 Australia's. 519 sales. That is not a thin market with a fragile median. That is a functioning residential real estate market with enough transaction volume to produce a figure you can trust as a genuine reflection of demand and supply. $232,000 as the median house price in a city with real heritage, real services, a base hospital, multiple schools, and an arts precinct that attracts visitors from across the country. That number requires some sitting with. In Sydney or Melbourne, it would not cover the deposit on a median-priced apartment. In Broken Hill, it is what a house costs. Not an entry-level house, the median. Broken Hill's history is inseparable from silver, lead and zinc. The Broken Hill Proprietary Company, which eventually became BHP, one of the world's largest mining corporations, began at the line of lode here in 1885. The mining history shaped everything: the town's layout, its labour movement history, the union culture that made Broken Hill a significant site in Australian working-class history, the civic infrastructure built during the mining boom decades, and the heritage streetscape that still stands along Argent Street today. This is not a town that was abandoned when the economy shifted. It is a town that adapted, diversified, and held on in a way that its Outback peers could not always manage. The arts community in Broken Hill deserves to be named as a concrete economic and cultural factor rather than a soft amenity. The Pro Heart Gallery, the work of the Brushman of the Bush, the filming location history that includes Mad Max and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. These are not incidental footnotes. They are evidence of a creative culture that developed in response to the landscape and the isolation, and produced work that is recognised well beyond the town's immediate geography. The town has a density of art galleries per capita that would be notable in any context. In an outback city of this size and location, it is striking. The drawbacks of Broken Hill are real and structured into its location. The city sits about 1,160 kilometres from Sydney by road, which is a drive of roughly 12 to 13 hours under reasonable conditions. The barrier highway that connects it to the east is not a casual commuter route. The climate is arid and hot. The barrier ranges create a landscape that receives very limited rainfall, and summer heat in Broken Hill regularly sits above 40 degrees. The city's water supply historically came from distance-delivered pipelines rather than local catchments, which speaks to how thoroughly the environment here operates against the assumptions that coastal city living builds into people. Medical services in Broken Hill are better than any other town on this list, which is a reflection of the city's size, rather than an indication that distance is no longer an issue. The Broken Hill Health Service provides a range of inpatient and outpatient care, but for complex specialist procedures, Sydney remains the reference point, and at 1,160 kilometres, that remains a significant logistical reality. The Royal Flying Doctor Service, which has its New South Wales base in Broken Hill, is one of the primary aviation medical services for the region. The presence of that base here is not coincidental. It reflects how central Broken Hill is to the remote medical access infrastructure of Western New South Wales. You might look at 232,000 Australian and think, that is not in the same category as 62,500 Australian in Andamooka. And you are right, it is not. But the comparison that matters is not within this list. The comparison that matters is between Broken Hill and any coastal city in Australia where 232,000 Australian is a deposit, not a purchase price. Broken Hill carries the highest median on this list and the highest sale volume by an enormous margin. 519 sales against Quilpie's 14, against Andamooka's 16. This is not a dot on the map that might vanish. It is a functioning city that the market is pricing like a frontier town because of the one thing it cannot change: the distance that surrounds it on every side. The heritage buildings along Argent Street, the town hall, the post office, the Palace Hotel with its Brushman of the Bush murals inside, were built with the confidence of a mining boom that expected Broken Hill to keep growing towards something larger. The boom stabilised instead of kept climbing, and the city that emerged is one of the more complete and characterful inland centres in the country, held at 232,000 Australia, because the 1,160 kilometres between it and Sydney never shortened, and the market has been factoring that distance into every transaction since the first ones were recorded. Locals who have been here for years will tell you the same thing, unprompted. The city keeps surprising people who arrive expecting nothing, and the distance keeps surprising people who arrived thinking they had calculated it accurately. The mining legacy is still physically present in Broken Hill, in ways that are not just museological. The line of lode miners' memorial on the hill above the city looks out over the entire townscape and the red flat landscape beyond it, and it memorialises the miners killed underground across the full history of operations here, a list that runs into the hundreds. That memorial is not a minor community monument. It is a significant civic statement about what this city was built on and what it cost. Walking the heritage precinct of Broken Hill in the late afternoon, when the light goes angular and the iron-stained earth turns vivid and the old buildings hold the heat in their stone walls, you understand in a physical way why the people who are here chose to stay and why the city is priced the way it is. Not because it lacks substance, but because it has too much distance in every direction for the market to pretend otherwise. A town where housing costs less than most city residents spend on a car, and a city with nearly 500 property transactions a year still sitting at a fraction of coastal prices. Same country, different physics. The Outback does not compress value the way metropolitan markets do. It expands the distance between what a place is worth and what it costs to be there, and the gap is always measured in more than dollars. The question is not whether these prices are real. They are. The question is what you are willing to trade for them, and whether the trade is one you can sustain past the first summer. Which of these towns would you actually commit to for a full year? Not a road trip, not a trial run, but a genuine move. Not the cheapest, not the biggest. The one that makes the most honest sense for how you actually live. Write it below. And if this format gives you a way to see places that the standard property platforms don't frame honestly, subscribe.